Picture this: a homeowner standing in front of their own house, holding a citation for a supposed violation so absurd it would make anyone's blood boil. The offense? Painting their front door a shade of blue that brought joy to an otherwise monotonous suburban street. The punishment? A threat of daily fines escalating into the thousands, a lien against the property, and ultimately, foreclosure. But this wasn't just about a door or a color. This was about one woman's obsession with control, her abuse of power within the HOA board, and her determination to make one homeowner's life absolutely miserable. What she didn't anticipate was that this particular homeowner would refuse to back down, would dig into the legal fine print she'd been weaponizing for years, and would ultimately expose a scheme so calculated that it would shake the entire community to its core. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness a story of resilience, legal maneuvering, and the sweetest form of justified revenge against an HOA tyrant who finally pushed the wrong person too far. This is the story of how one vibrant blue door became the catalyst for dismantling a regime of petty tyranny, and how legal advice transformed a victim into a victor. Marcus Chen had purchased his home in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision 3 years prior, drawn by the tree-lined streets, well-maintained common areas, and the promise of a peaceful suburban lifestyle. The neighborhood was typical of many master-planned communities across America: rows of similar 2-story homes with manicured lawns, a small community pool, and a clubhouse that hosted the occasional neighborhood gathering. The homes were pleasant but uniform, constructed in various shades of beige, tan, and gray that created a visual monotony Marcus had never quite appreciated. Marcus was a graphic designer who worked from home, someone whose professional life revolved around color, creativity, and visual impact. His home office overlooked the front yard, and day after day he'd stare out at the sea of neutral tones that defined his neighborhood. It wasn't that he disliked his neighbors or the community itself. The location was convenient, the schools were good, and most residents were friendly enough. But something about the enforced blandness of the streetscape felt suffocating to someone whose entire career celebrated boldness and individual expression. The HOA board consisted of 5 members, but everyone in Meadowbrook Estates knew that one person truly ran the show: Patricia Aldridge. Patricia was a retired real estate agent in her early 60s who had lived in the neighborhood since its development 15 years earlier. She'd served on the HOA board for over a decade, and for the past 5 years, she'd held the position of board president. Patricia had a reputation, one that was whispered about at neighborhood barbecues and discussed in hushed tones at the community pool. She was meticulous, some said obsessively so, about the appearance of the neighborhood. She walked the streets daily with a clipboard, noting any violation she could find. A trash can visible from the street after collection day, a mailbox that needed repainting, grass that exceeded the permitted height by half an inch. But have you ever met someone who seemed to relish the power their position gave them just a little too much? Patricia was that person. Her enforcement of HOA rules went beyond mere diligence and crossed into something more personal, more vindictive. She had favorites in the neighborhood, homeowners whose violations were overlooked or given gentle warnings. And then she had her targets, people who had somehow offended her or challenged her authority, who found themselves drowning in citations and fines for the most trivial of infractions. Marcus had managed to stay off Patricia's radar for his first 3 years in Meadowbrook Estates. He kept his lawn trimmed, his trash cans hidden, and his home's exterior in compliance with the extensive list of architectural guidelines. He'd heard the stories about Patricia's wrath, but had witnessed it only from a distance, watching as she'd driven one elderly couple to sell their home after relentlessly citing them for violations stemming from their inability to maintain their property due to health issues. Marcus had felt sympathy for them but had remained silent, as had most of the neighborhood. No one wanted to become Patricia's next target. The trouble began innocently enough when Marcus decided to repaint his front door. The original door had been a standard beige that matched the home's trim, but years of sun exposure had left it faded and weathered. Marcus saw this necessary maintenance as an opportunity. Why not choose a color that would bring some personality to his home, something that would make him smile when he pulled into his driveway after a long day? He spent weeks considering options, finally settling on a beautiful shade of coastal blue, reminiscent of doors he'd seen during a vacation to Charleston. It was elegant, tasteful, and certainly not garish or offensive. Before painting, Marcus did what any responsible homeowner would do. He reviewed the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the legal document that governed property modifications in Meadowbrook Estates. The section on exterior paint colors was surprisingly vague, stating that exterior colors must be harmonious with the neighborhood aesthetic and subject to Architectural Review Committee approval for significant changes. Marcus interpreted a front door as a minor accent detail rather than a significant change, especially since the body of his house remained unchanged. He'd seen other homes in the neighborhood with dark brown doors, forest green doors, even a deep red door on a home 2 streets over. Surely, he reasoned, a tasteful blue would be acceptable. He hired a professional painter, and over a weekend, his front door was transformed. The coastal blue was stunning, exactly what Marcus had envisioned. It complemented his home's gray siding beautifully and added a welcoming pop of color that made his house feel more like a home and less like a cookie-cutter subdivision unit. His immediate neighbors complimented the choice, with several expressing admiration for his boldness in breaking from the neighborhood's neutral palette. For exactly 4 days, Marcus enjoyed his new blue door. On the 5th day, he found a formal violation notice from the HOA tucked into his mailbox. The notice, signed by Patricia Aldridge in her capacity as board president, cited him for an unauthorized exterior color modification and demanded that he repaint his door to an approved color within 15 days or face daily fines of $50. Attached to the notice was a color palette showing various shades of beige, tan, cream, and gray, with a note indicating these were the only acceptable colors for any exterior element of homes in Meadowbrook Estates. Are you starting to see how this seemingly simple home improvement project was about to spiral into something much larger? Because Marcus certainly didn't expect what was coming next when he decided to challenge that first violation notice. Marcus's initial reaction to the violation notice was confusion rather than anger. He reread the HOA's CCRs multiple times, finding nothing that explicitly prohibited his door color or required pre-approval for repainting an existing element in a different color. The document Patricia had attached, showing approved colors, wasn't part of the official CCRs he'd received at closing. It appeared to be a guideline document created by the board, but it had never been formally adopted through the amendment process outlined in the governing documents. This distinction mattered, legally speaking. The CCRs were legally binding restrictions that ran with the property and could only be modified through a specific process requiring homeowner votes. Guidelines created by the board were just that: guidelines, not enforceable rules. Marcus, who had a logical mind honed by years of problem-solving in his design work, saw this discrepancy immediately. He drafted a careful professional response to the HOA explaining his position, citing the relevant sections of the CCRs, and requesting that the violation be withdrawn. Patricia's response came within 48 hours, and it was anything but professional. Her email, copied to the entire HOA board and marked as official correspondence, dismissed Marcus's legal arguments as creative interpretations by someone clearly looking to disrupt neighborhood harmony. She doubled down on the violation, informing Marcus that the 15-day deadline remained in effect and that failure to comply would result in daily fines as previously stated. She concluded by suggesting that if Marcus was unhappy with the HOA's rules, perhaps Meadowbrook Estates wasn't the right community for him. The condescending tone of Patricia's response ignited something in Marcus. This wasn't just about a door anymore. This was about a bully with a clipboard who had terrorized his neighborhood for years without anyone effectively challenging her authority. Marcus began researching HOA law, discovering that his state had specific statutes governing homeowners associations, including requirements for rule enforcement, fine procedures, and board member conduct. What he found was troubling. Patricia was violating multiple procedural requirements in her handling of his case. Have you ever noticed how bullies operate most effectively in the dark, counting on their victims' ignorance of their rights? Patricia had built her little empire on exactly that principle, and Marcus was about to shine a very bright light on her methods. First, according to state law, the HOA was required to provide homeowners with written notice of any violation and an opportunity for a hearing before the board before any fines could be imposed. Patricia's notice had included a fine threat, but no mention of Marcus's right to a hearing. Second, the HOA board couldn't unilaterally create new rules that went beyond the CCRs without following a formal rulemaking process that included homeowner notice and comment, the approved color palette. Patricia was enforcing appeared to have been created by her without any such process. Marcus requested a formal hearing before the board, as was his right. Patricia scheduled it for 3 weeks out, the maximum time permitted under the bylaws, clearly hoping to drag out the process and pressure Marcus into compliance. In the meantime, Marcus's 15-day compliance deadline passed, and Patricia began assessing daily $50 fines. Marcus received automated notices every few days showing his accumulating balance: $50, $100, $300, $500. But Marcus wasn't intimidated. He was documenting everything, saving every email, every notice, every automated fine letter. He began walking his neighborhood with his phone camera, documenting every single exterior modification he could find. Doors in colors not on Patricia's approved palette, decorative shutters in various shades, mailboxes that didn't match the standard beige outdoor light fixtures in oil-rubbed bronze and brushed nickel rather than the builder standard brass. He counted 37 homes with modifications that should have triggered violations under Patricia's interpretation of the rules, yet none of these homeowners had been cited. This is where Marcus began to understand the true nature of Patricia's enforcement pattern. She was selective, almost surgical in who she targeted. The 37 homes he'd documented belonged to homeowners who were friendly with Patricia, who attended her social gatherings, who supported her in board elections. Meanwhile, the few homeowners who'd ever questioned her decisions or failed to show proper deference found themselves buried in violation notices. When the hearing date finally arrived, Marcus walked into the community clubhouse armed with a binder 3 inches thick containing his research, photographs, correspondence, and legal citations. The board sat at a folding table at the front of the room, Patricia in the center, flanked by 2 retired neighbors Marcus recognized, but had never spoken to, and 2 working professionals who Marcus knew attended meetings only sporadically. About a dozen other homeowners were scattered in the audience, drawn by neighborhood gossip about the dispute. Patricia conducted the hearing with the air of someone presiding over a foregone conclusion. She summarized her version of events, portraying Marcus as a rogue homeowner who had willfully violated clear standards, and then attempted to lawyer his way out of compliance with technical arguments. She presented enlarged photographs of Marcus's blue door as if it were evidence of a crime, pointing out how it disrupted the visual harmony of the street. Then it was Marcus's turn to speak. He calmly walked through his argument, showing the board that the color palette Patricia was enforcing appeared nowhere in the governing documents. He explained the legal distinction between CCRs and board guidelines, noting that the board couldn't create new restrictions without following proper procedures. Then he distributed copies of his photographic survey, showing board members and audience members the dozens of homes in violation of Patricia's standard if it were to be applied consistently. Can you imagine the look on Patricia's face as Marcus methodically dismantled her position in front of the board and an audience of neighbors? But here's where things got really interesting. One of the working professionals on the board, a woman named Jennifer who worked as a paralegal, began asking questions. She'd clearly been going through the motions as a board member, signing whatever Patricia put in front of her without much scrutiny. But Marcus's presentation had her attention. She asked to see the CCRs and the color palette document. When Patricia tried to move the discussion along, Jennifer cut her off, stating that this was a legal matter and the board had a fiduciary duty to get it right. For the next 45 minutes, the hearing devolved into an argument between Patricia and Jennifer, with Patricia insisting that her interpretation of the rules had been board policy for years, and Jennifer pointing out that an undefined policy didn't override the actual governing documents. The other three board members sat in uncomfortable silence, clearly out of their depth and unsure whose side to take. The hearing ended without a resolution, with Jennifer insisting that the board needed to consult with the HOA's attorney before proceeding. Patricia was furious, her face flushed as she tersely adjourned the meeting. As homeowners filed out, several approached Marcus privately, sharing their own stories of Patricia's targeted enforcement, thanking him for finally standing up to her, but expressing fear of becoming her next target if they supported him publicly. Over the following 2 weeks, Marcus's situation deteriorated rapidly. His fine balance climbed past $1,500. He received a notice that the HOA was preparing to file a lien against his property for unpaid assessments, the first step toward foreclosure under the HOA's collection policy. Patricia sent him a formal letter offering to resolve the matter if he would repaint his door, pay a reduced fine of $500, and sign a statement acknowledging the board's authority to enforce the color palette. It was extortion dressed up in legal language, and Marcus refused. Instead, he did something Patricia didn't expect. He consulted with an attorney who specialized in HOA law. The consultation cost $300, money Marcus considered well spent when the attorney confirmed his analysis and explained several other violations of state law in Patricia's handling of the case. The attorney also shared something fascinating. Several other homeowners from Meadowbrook Estates had consulted with her over the years about Patricia's enforcement practices, but each had ultimately backed down rather than fight. Marcus asked what it would cost to fight. The attorney estimated $3,000 to $5,000 to see the matter through to resolution, possibly including litigation if the HOA didn't back down. It was a sobering figure, far more than simply repainting his door would cost. But by this point, Marcus understood that this was bigger than his door or even his own situation. Patricia was going to keep doing this to people, keep abusing her position, keep making homeowners' lives miserable unless someone finally stopped her. Does money matter when principles are at stake, when you have the chance to stop someone from victimizing others? Marcus decided it didn't, at least not in this case. He retained the attorney, and that decision changed everything. Within days, the attorney sent a formal demand letter to the HOA board, copying Patricia, outlining the legal deficiencies in the enforcement action and the potential liability the HOA faced for violating state law. The letter demanded that all fines be reversed, the violation be withdrawn, and the board implement proper procedures for rule enforcement in the future. It also contained a veiled reference to potential claims for selective enforcement and abuse of process. Patricia's response was to escalate. She called an emergency board meeting, excluded Jennifer from the meeting by claiming she'd shown bias during the hearing. She convinced the 3 remaining board members to ratify a formal assessment against Marcus's property, officially creating a debt that would lead to a lien. She also sent a neighborhood-wide email framing Marcus as a selfish homeowner who was costing the HOA thousands in legal fees because he refused to comply with basic community standards. But Patricia had made a critical mistake. By excluding Jennifer from the board meeting, she'd violated the HOA's own bylaws regarding board composition and voting requirements. Jennifer immediately resigned from the board in protest and sent her own email to the neighborhood explaining what had happened and expressing concerns about Patricia's leadership. Several other homeowners began speaking up, sharing their own Patricia horror stories in neighborhood social media groups. The community was fracturing, and Patricia, who'd ruled through fear and intimidation for years, suddenly found herself facing organized opposition. A group of concerned homeowners began meeting privately, discussing the possibility of recalling Patricia from the board. Marcus's blue door had become a symbol of resistance against HOA tyranny, and people were angry at what his legal research had revealed about Patricia's years of selective, vindictive enforcement. Are you beginning to see how one person's refusal to be bullied can inspire others to find their own courage? Because what happened next would prove that point spectacularly. The situation reached a boiling point at the next regular HOA board meeting, scheduled for a Tuesday evening in late September. The community clubhouse, which typically hosted 10 to 12 homeowners for these monthly meetings, was packed with over 80 residents, far exceeding the room's comfortable capacity. People stood along the walls, sat on the floor, and crowded in the doorway. The air was electric with anticipation. Patricia had attempted to maintain control by circulating an agenda that limited homeowner comment to 3 minutes per person on non-agenda items, with Marcus's situation notably absent from the formal agenda. But the crowd wasn't there to be controlled, and they certainly weren't there to adhere to Patricia's procedural manipulations. Marcus attended with his attorney, who sat quietly beside him, taking notes. He'd also invited Jennifer, the paralegal who'd resigned from the board, who'd spent the previous 2 weeks doing her own investigation into HOA finances and Patricia's handling of board business over the years. What Jennifer had discovered was explosive, and she'd shared it with Marcus and his attorney in a meeting 2 days before this board session. Patricia called the meeting to order, her voice tight with barely controlled anger as she noted the unusual attendance. She attempted to rush through standard business items, approving the previous meeting's minutes, discussing the landscaping budget for the common areas, and reviewing the pool maintenance schedule. Several homeowners tried to interrupt, wanting to address the elephant in the room, but Patricia cut them off, insisting they wait for the homeowner comment period at the meeting's end. But 20 minutes into the meeting, when Patricia asked for a motion to approve an expenditure for tree trimming, Jennifer stood up from the audience. She wasn't a board member anymore, but she was a homeowner with every right to speak, and she had something to say that couldn't wait. Jennifer addressed the board directly, her voice clear and steady despite the tension in the room. She stated that before the board approved any further expenditures, there were serious questions about the HOA's finances that needed to be addressed. Patricia tried to shut her down, insisting that financial questions weren't on the agenda. Still, Jennifer continued, noting that as a homeowner, she had the right to inspect HOA records, which she'd done the previous week. What Jennifer revealed in the next 10 minutes stunned everyone in that room. Over the past 5 years, under Patricia's leadership, the HOA had collected over $70,000 in fines from homeowners, supposedly for various violations. However, according to the HOA's governing documents, fine revenue was supposed to be segregated into a special account and used only for enforcement-related expenses or returned to homeowners if not needed. Jennifer had reviewed the financial records and discovered that this account didn't exist. The fine revenue had been deposited into the general operating account and used for regular expenses, effectively supplementing the annual assessments all homeowners paid. This might not sound immediately dramatic, but the implications were massive. It meant that Patricia had been using aggressive enforcement and fine assessment as a revenue generation scheme, essentially taxing homeowners through violations rather than through the proper process of raising annual assessments, which would have required homeowner approval. It also raised serious questions about whether Patricia had been citing homeowners for violations specifically to generate revenue rather than to maintain community standards. But Jennifer wasn't finished. She'd also discovered that the HOA had paid over $30,000 to the association's law firm over the past 3 years, supposedly for various legal matters. However, when Jennifer requested documentation of what services the firm had provided, she discovered that much of this money had paid for Patricia's personal consultations with the attorney about enforcement matters, some of which appeared to have nothing to do with association business. In essence, Patricia had been using HOA funds to pay for her personal legal advice about how to pursue her vendettas against homeowners she didn't like. The room erupted. Homeowners were shouting questions, demanding explanations, calling for Patricia's resignation. Patricia's face had gone from red to white, and she was frantically flipping through papers in front of her as if they might contain some defense against what Jennifer had just revealed. The other two remaining board members, both elderly retirees who'd clearly been rubber-stamping Patricia's decisions for years without scrutiny, looked shell-shocked. Marcus's attorney stood up and asked to address the board. Patricia was in no position to refuse at this point, and the attorney spent 5 minutes calmly explaining the legal implications of what Jennifer had uncovered. The misuse of fine revenue potentially violated state nonprofit corporation laws and could result in personal liability for board members who'd approved the financial arrangements. The payment of HOA funds for Patricia's personal legal matters was a clear breach of fiduciary duty, and the pattern of targeted enforcement Marcus had documented, combined with the apparent revenue motivation for that enforcement, could support claims of harassment and abuse of process. Then the attorney dropped the real bomb. Marcus was prepared to file a lawsuit against the HOA and Patricia personally, seeking damages for the stress and financial harm caused by the improper enforcement action, legal fees, and punitive damages for the apparent bad faith in Patricia's conduct. However, he was willing to forego litigation if the HOA took immediate corrective action, reverse all fines against Marcus, remove the assessment lien from his property, reimburse his legal fees, accept his blue door as compliant, and implement proper oversight procedures to prevent future abuse. Oh, and Patricia needed to resign from the board immediately. Can you imagine being Patricia in that moment, watching 5 years of unchecked power evaporate in the space of an hour? But it wasn't Marcus or his attorney who delivered the final blow. From the back of the room, an elderly man named Robert stood up. Marcus recognized him vaguely as someone who lived several streets over, though they'd never spoken. Robert's voice shook with emotion as he told his story. He and his wife had been the elderly couple Marcus had watched being driven from the neighborhood 3 years earlier. Patricia had cited them repeatedly for yard maintenance violations during a period when Robert's wife was undergoing chemotherapy and he was her primary caregiver. The fines had accumulated to over $4,000, and facing the threat of a lien and possible foreclosure, they'd sold their home of 20 years and moved to a smaller condo. Robert had returned to Meadowbrook Estates specifically for this meeting after hearing about Marcus's situation through a friend still living in the neighborhood. He'd brought documentation of the violations Patricia had cited him for, many of which were for issues like a lawn that was too long by less than an inch, or a garden bed that extended 6 inches beyond the approved boundary shown on outdated architectural plans. He'd also brought photographs from that period showing the same violations on dozens of other properties in the neighborhood, none of which had been cited. The room went silent as Robert described the financial and emotional devastation Patricia's campaign had caused his family. They'd sold their home at a loss in a buyer's market, desperate to escape before the HOA lien destroyed their credit. His wife had passed away 8 months later, and Robert was convinced the stress of the HOA situation had contributed to her decline. He'd lived with guilt for 3 years, feeling like he'd let her down by not fighting harder, by surrendering their home without a real battle. Tears were streaming down Robert's face as he finished his story, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. He looked directly at Patricia and said something that would echo in Marcus's mind for years. "You made the last months of my wife's life more miserable than cancer did. And you did it because you could, because you enjoyed having power over people who couldn't fight back. But someone's finally standing up to you, and I hope you face consequences for every bit of pain you've caused." The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Homeowners were calling for an immediate vote to remove Patricia from the board. Others were demanding a full forensic audit of HOA finances. Several people approached Robert to offer support and apologies for not helping him years earlier. Patricia sat frozen at the board table, her carefully constructed authority crumbling around her. One of the remaining board members, a retired accountant named Harold who'd been largely silent throughout his tenure, finally found his voice. He stated that he'd been unaware of the financial irregularities Jennifer had described and was personally appalled by what he'd learned this evening. He moved to accept Patricia's resignation from the board, effective immediately. When Patricia protested that she hadn't resigned, Harold stated that, given the severity of the fiduciary breaches, the board had grounds to remove her for cause. If she didn't resign voluntarily, he would move for her formal removal. Patricia looked around the room, perhaps hoping for support or sympathy, but found only angry, disgusted faces staring back at her. Her little empire, built over years of intimidation and manipulation, had collapsed in a single evening. She gathered her papers with shaking hands and walked out of the clubhouse without another word, pushing through the crowd of homeowners who parted silently to let her pass. After Patricia's departure, the meeting continued for another 2 hours. The remaining board members, shaken but trying to restore order, unanimously voted to rescind all fines against Marcus, remove any assessments or liens, and recognize his blue door as compliant with community standards. They also voted to engage an independent attorney to review the HOA's financial practices and enforcement procedures, and to conduct a full audit of the past 5 years of HOA operations. Marcus stood and addressed the meeting, thanking everyone for their support, but also acknowledging the cost of his fight. He noted that Robert and many others had suffered because the community had remained silent too long, allowing Patricia to operate without accountability. He challenged his neighbors to stay engaged, to attend board meetings, to ask questions, and never again to allow one person to accumulate unchecked power over their community. The response was overwhelming. Homeowners approached Marcus throughout the evening, apologizing for not supporting him earlier, sharing their own Patricia stories, and pledging to be more active in HOA governance in the future. Several people asked for Robert's contact information, wanting to reach out to him directly. There was a sense in the room that something had fundamentally shifted, that a community had rediscovered its collective voice after years of intimidation-induced silence. But the evening wasn't quite over. As people were beginning to leave, Marcus's attorney received an email on her phone. It was from Patricia's personal email address, sent to the entire HOA board and copied to Marcus and his attorney. In it, Patricia formally announced her resignation from the HOA board, citing personal reasons and health concerns. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a terse 2-paragraph statement ending her 15-year reign over Meadowbrook Estates. How does someone who wielded power so ruthlessly for so long walk away when finally confronted? But then again, what choice did Patricia have once her schemes were exposed and her support evaporated? The weeks following the dramatic board meeting brought sweeping changes to Meadowbrook Estates. Harold, the retired accountant, assumed the role of interim board president and immediately implemented new transparency measures. Board meetings were now recorded and posted online. Financial statements were distributed to all homeowners monthly rather than annually. The board established an ombudsman position, filled by Jennifer, to handle homeowner concerns about enforcement actions and ensure violations were handled fairly and consistently. The forensic audit, completed 6 weeks after Patricia's resignation, revealed the full extent of the financial irregularities. Beyond the misappropriated fine revenue and questionable legal expenses Jennifer had identified, the audit uncovered additional problems. Patricia had authorized payments to certain vendors without competitive bidding, several of whom turned out to be owned by her relatives or friends. She'd approved landscaping and maintenance work on her own property using HOA funds, disguising these expenses as work on common areas. In total, the audit identified approximately $47,000 in questionable expenditures over 5 years. The board consulted with their new attorney about potential legal action against Patricia to recover these funds. However, the attorney advised that litigation would be expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of recovery even if they prevailed in court. Patricia's main assets were her home in the neighborhood, which she'd already listed for sale, and retirement accounts that might be protected from judgment. The board ultimately decided to report the findings to the state's Attorney General's office, which had jurisdiction over nonprofit corporation fraud, and to let criminal prosecutors decide whether to pursue charges. Patricia sold her home within 3 weeks of listing it, accepting an offer well below market value in her apparent haste to leave Meadowbrook Estates. She moved out of state, and Marcus never learned what ultimately happened with the Attorney General's investigation. But the damage to her reputation was permanent. In a connected world where background checks are standard, her HOA presidency and the circumstances of her resignation were now part of her permanent digital footprint, a scarlet letter for anyone who researched her name. For Marcus, the immediate impact was relief. His blue door remained blue, a daily reminder of his successful stand against petty tyranny. The HOA reimbursed his legal fees, approximately $4,800, and formally apologized for the stress caused by the improper enforcement action. But the financial compensation and the vindication, while satisfying, weren't the most meaningful outcome for Marcus. What mattered more was the transformation he witnessed in his community. Board meetings that once attracted a handful of bored homeowners now regularly drew 30 to 40 engaged residents. People who'd never spoken to their neighbors before were organizing block parties and social gatherings. A sense of collective ownership over the community had emerged, replacing the previous climate of fear and compliance. The board undertook a comprehensive review of the HOA's governing documents, identifying numerous provisions that were outdated, vague, or inconsistent with current state law. They organized a series of town halls where homeowners could discuss what kind of community they wanted Meadowbrook Estates to be. The consensus was clear. People wanted reasonable standards that maintained property values and community aesthetics, but they wanted those standards applied fairly and with flexibility for individual expression. The result was a completely rewritten set of architectural guidelines approved by a 78% vote of the membership. The new guidelines provided objective standards where possible and eliminated subjective requirements that had given Patricia room to enforce her personal preferences. Regarding exterior colors, the new guidelines specified that front doors may be painted in any color that complements the home's primary exterior color scheme, subject to a simple notification process, but not requiring pre-approval. Marcus's blue door, once the subject of such controversy, was now explicitly permitted under the new rules. More importantly, the new guidelines included robust due process protections for homeowners accused of violations. Every violation notice had to include a specific citation to the applicable rule, photographic evidence of the alleged violation, and clear information about the homeowner's right to a hearing and appeal process. Fines could only be assessed after a hearing, and only if the violation was willful or the homeowner failed to cure the violation after being given a reasonable opportunity. Selective enforcement was explicitly prohibited, with provisions allowing homeowners to present evidence of similar violations being ignored elsewhere in the community. Robert, the elderly widower who'd shared his heartbreaking story at the climactic board meeting, became an unexpected friend of Marcus. They began meeting regularly for coffee, and Robert shared more details of his experience with Patricia's enforcement campaign. Marcus learned that Robert had tried to fight at the time, had actually consulted with an attorney who'd advised him that he had good defenses against the violations. But Robert's wife's medical expenses had depleted their savings, and they couldn't afford a legal battle. Faced with mounting fines and the threat of losing their home entirely through foreclosure, they'd chosen the path of least resistance and sold. Marcus was haunted by Robert's story, by the knowledge that his own successful fight had been possible largely because he'd had the financial resources to retain an attorney and weather the storm of accumulating fines. He'd won not just because he was right, but because he could afford to prove he was right. This realization led Marcus to propose something new to the HOA board, a legal assistance fund for homeowners facing enforcement actions. The concept was simple but revolutionary for an HOA. A portion of annual assessment revenue would be set aside in a fund that any homeowner could access to consult with an attorney if they believed an enforcement action against them was improper. The board initially resisted, fearing it would encourage frivolous challenges to legitimate enforcement actions. But Marcus argued persuasively that the fund would actually protect the HOA by ensuring enforcement actions were properly grounded before they escalated into expensive litigation. If a homeowner could consult with an attorney early and that attorney confirmed the HOA's position was legally sound, the homeowner would be less likely to fight a losing battle. Conversely, if the attorney identified problems with the enforcement action, the HOA could correct course before investing heavily in an improper position. The board agreed to a pilot program, establishing a modest fund of $5,000 annually. In the 2 years following its creation, the fund was accessed 7 times. In 5 cases, the consulting attorney confirmed the HOA's enforcement action was appropriate, and the homeowners accepted this neutral assessment and complied. In 2 cases, the attorney identified procedural problems with how violations were being handled, which the HOA was able to correct without any animosity or legal action. The fund proved so successful that the board doubled its annual allocation and promoted the program as a selling point for prospective homebuyers considering Meadowbrook estates. Marcus's blue door became something of a neighborhood landmark. Several other homeowners, emboldened by the new guidelines, painted their own front doors in various colors: a cheerful yellow, a sophisticated charcoal, a deep burgundy. Even one homeowner who chose a bold coral that Marcus secretly thought was a bit much, but defended vigorously as an expression of personal style. The street that had once been a monotonous sea of beige now had character and personality. Property values, rather than declining as Patricia had always warned would happen if strict conformity wasn't maintained, actually increased. It turned out that homebuyers appreciated a community that looked lived in and loved rather than sterile and controlled. About a year after the confrontation, Marcus was contacted by a local television news reporter who'd heard about his story from another homeowner in the neighborhood. The reporter was working on a segment about HOA abuses and wanted to interview Marcus about his experience. Marcus agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to shine a light on a problem that affected countless homeowners across the country. The segment aired during Sweeps Week and generated significant attention. Marcus received emails from dozens of homeowners in other communities facing similar situations with overbearing HOA boards. Some were seeking advice, others just wanted to share their stories with someone who understood. Marcus was struck by how common these experiences were, how many people felt powerless against HOA boards that had forgotten they existed to serve homeowners, not rule over them. This led Marcus to create a website and blog where he shared information about HOA law, homeowner rights, and strategies for dealing with enforcement actions. He partnered with several attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes, creating a referral network for homeowners who needed legal help. The website wasn't a money-making venture, just a way to pay forward the support and resources that had enabled his own successful fight. Through the site, Marcus connected with HOA reform advocates across the country, discovering a whole movement of people working to increase transparency and accountability in community associations. One of the most gratifying developments came 2 years after the initial confrontation, when 2 homeowners approached Marcus from a neighboring subdivision. They'd read about his experience online and were facing a similar situation with their own HOA board president, who was abusing enforcement powers. They asked Marcus to speak at one of their board meetings to share his story and the lessons learned from Meadowbrook Estate's experience. Marcus agreed, and what began as a single speaking engagement evolved into something larger. Over the next year, Marcus spoke at board meetings and homeowner gatherings in 7 different communities within a 50-mile radius. Each had its own version of Patricia, though the names and faces changed. There were the board members who used violations as weapons against neighbors they personally disliked. There were architectural committees that rejected modification requests based on arbitrary aesthetic preferences rather than documented standards. There were the treasurers who mismanaged HOA funds, while homeowners remained in the dark about financial details. The specifics varied, but the underlying pattern was always the same. A small group of people had accumulated power within their communities and were wielding it without meaningful accountability. Marcus's presentations weren't just about his own experience. He'd developed a comprehensive overview of homeowner rights. These red flags might indicate HOA mismanagement or abuse, and practical steps residents could take to increase transparency and accountability in their communities. He provided templates for requesting records reviews, explained how to understand HOA financial statements, and outlined the process for amending governing documents or recalling board members. Most importantly, he emphasized that change was possible, that even entrenched power structures could be dismantled when homeowners organized and insisted on their rights. The speaking engagements also revealed something unexpected. There were Patricia-like figures in positions of HOA leadership throughout the region, but there were also many well-intentioned board members who didn't understand their legal obligations or the limits of their authority. Predecessors had told some that certain enforcement practices were proper when they actually weren't. Others had inherited vague governing documents and were doing their best to apply them fairly, but lacked legal guidance. Marcus's presentations helped educate these board members as much as the homeowners in the audience, creating a shared understanding of what proper HOA governance looked like. Back in Meadowbrook Estates, the transformation continued. The board established a welcoming committee for new residents, providing them with a comprehensive information packet about the HOA, a summary of their rights and responsibilities, and contact information for board members who were now accessible rather than intimidating. The neighborhood newsletter, once used primarily to announce violations and remind residents of rules, became a genuine community connection tool, featuring neighbor profiles, local event announcements, and celebration of community improvements. Jennifer, who'd played such a crucial role in exposing Patricia's financial misconduct, was elected to the board in the first election after Patricia's departure. She brought her paralegal background to bear in establishing proper policies and procedures for board operations. She created a comprehensive policy manual addressing everything from how violations should be investigated and documented to how contractors should be selected for maintenance work. These policies, approved by the full board and shared with all homeowners, removed the ambiguity that had previously allowed selective and arbitrary enforcement. Perhaps most significantly, the board initiated quarterly community forums where any homeowner could raise concerns, ask questions, or propose ideas without the formal structure of a board meeting. These forums were held on Saturday mornings at the community clubhouse, with coffee and pastries provided, creating a relaxed atmosphere for genuine dialogue. Attendance at these forums was strong, typically drawing 40 to 60 residents, and the discussions that emerged helped the board understand community priorities and address concerns before they escalated into conflicts. Marcus himself was approached multiple times about running for the HOA board, but he consistently declined. His interest wasn't in governing the HOA, but in ensuring it was governed properly by people who understood their role as servants of the community rather than rulers over it. He was content to remain an engaged homeowner, attending meetings regularly and speaking up when necessary, but leaving the day-to-day management to others who had more interest in that work. What about the psychological impact of the entire ordeal? For Marcus, the experience had been stressful but ultimately empowering. He'd discovered that he dared to stand up for himself and others, even when facing potential financial loss and social isolation. He'd learned to navigate complex legal issues and to advocate effectively for a cause he believed in. These were skills and experiences that extended beyond the HOA dispute. influencing how he approached challenges in other areas of his life. But the experience had also revealed something darker about human nature: how easily people could abuse small amounts of power, and how readily communities could become complicit through their silence. Marcus thought often about the years Patricia had operated unchecked, the homeowners who'd suffered under her enforcement campaigns, and the collective failure of the community to intervene. He'd been guilty of that same silence himself during his first 3 years in the neighborhood, watching from a distance as Patricia drove Robert and his wife from their home. This guilt motivated much of Marcus's advocacy work in other communities. He couldn't undo the damage Patricia had caused to Robert and others, but he could try to prevent similar situations from developing elsewhere. He could encourage homeowners to speak up early, to question authority when it seemed to be misused, to understand that their silence enabled abuse even when they weren't the direct targets. Robert himself experienced a measure of healing through the entire ordeal. At the same time, nothing could bring back his wife or undo the pain of their final months together, knowing that Patricia had been held accountable, provided some closure. Robert reconnected with former neighbors from Meadowbrook Estates, attending some of the community events and board meetings, finding that he still had friends in the neighborhood who regretted not supporting him during his struggle. The community's acknowledgement of the injustice he'd suffered and their commitment to ensuring it never happened again mattered more than any financial compensation could have. The new board even took the unprecedented step of issuing a formal written apology to Robert, acknowledging the HOA's failure to protect him and his wife from Patricia's abusive enforcement campaign. They invited him to speak at a board meeting, where he shared his story with the newer residents who hadn't been present during the climactic meeting where he first came forward. The board also established a small memorial garden in the common area dedicated to all members of our community who have faced adversity, a subtle but meaningful acknowledgement of what Robert and others had endured. 3 years after the confrontation, Marcus was approached by a regional newspaper for a follow-up story on how Meadowbrook Estates had changed since Patricia's departure. The reporter interviewed multiple homeowners, board members, and even contacted Patricia for comment, though she declined to respond. The resulting article painted a picture of a community transformed, not just in its governance but in its culture and sense of identity. Homeowners interviewed for the article spoke about feeling safe to express themselves, to make reasonable modifications to their properties without fear of retribution. Board members discussed the satisfaction of serving a community that trusted and supported them, rather than feared and resented them. Property values in Meadowbrook Estates had risen faster than comparable subdivisions in the area, with real estate agents noting that the community's reputation for fair governance and engaged residents made it a desirable location. The article included a photograph of Marcus standing in front of his home, his blue door prominently featured. The caption read, "Sometimes a single act of resistance can change an entire community." Marcus kept that newspaper clipping on his home office wall, not as a trophy of his victory, but as a reminder of why individual courage mattered, why speaking up against injustice was worth the personal cost. Did the experience change Marcus's perspective on HOAs generally? Absolutely. He'd entered homeownership with a naive assumption that HOA boards existed to serve community interests and would naturally operate fairly and transparently. His experience taught him that organizations are only as ethical as the people running them, and that without accountability, mechanisms, and engaged oversight, even homeowners associations created with good intentions could become instruments of petty tyranny. But Marcus also learned that HOAs could be forces for genuine good when properly managed. The reformed Meadowbrook Estates HOA actually enhanced the quality of life for residents, maintaining common areas effectively, organizing community events that brought neighbors together, and creating a framework for resolving disputes without litigation. The difference between the Patricia-era HOA and the reformed version wasn't the existence of rules or governance structures, but rather who controlled those structures and how they wielded that control. Marcus became an advocate for HOA reform legislation at the state level, testifying before legislative committees considering bills to strengthen homeowner protections and increase HOA transparency. He joined a coalition of homeowners, attorneys, and even some enlightened HOA board members who recognized that better governance standards would benefit everyone involved. Some of this advocacy was successful, resulting in new laws that required HOAs to provide better notice of enforcement actions, established clearer standards for imposing fines, and made it easier for homeowners to access HOA records. The Blue Door itself became something of a teaching tool for Marcus. When speaking to groups about HOA issues, he would often begin by asking a simple question: should someone be threatened with losing their home because they painted their door the wrong color? The absurdity of the premise helped people understand how HOA enforcement could spiral out of control, how reasonable rules could be weaponized by unreasonable people, and why oversight and accountability mattered so much in community associations. As the years passed, the story of Marcus and the Blue Door became part of Meadowbrook Estate's community lore, shared with new residents as an explanation for why the HOA operated the way it did. Some longtime residents worried that the story would give the community a negative reputation, but the opposite proved true. Homebuyers were attracted to a neighborhood that had confronted problems and reformed itself, seeing it as evidence of a mature, engaged community rather than one that swept issues under the rug. Patricia's legacy in Meadowbrook Estates was ultimately one of caution rather than success. Her name became shorthand for the kind of HOA leadership the community had rejected, a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked. Current and future board members understood that they were expected to serve transparently and fairly, and that the community would not tolerate a return to the Patricia era of intimidation and selective enforcement. For Marcus personally, the experience shaped his understanding of civic engagement and social justice in ways that extended far beyond HOA issues. He'd learned that standing up to bullies and abusive authority figures was possible, but that it required courage, resources, and often the support of others who'd been victimized. He'd discovered that systems of abuse persist not because they're invulnerable, but because challenging them requires effort and risk that most people aren't willing to undertake. And he'd seen firsthand how one person's willingness to fight could inspire others and catalyze systemic change. The friendships Marcus formed through the experience were unexpected, but deeply meaningful. Jennifer became not just a neighbor, but a close friend, someone he respected for her willingness to speak truth to power, even when it cost her position on the board. Robert, despite the age difference, became a mentor of sorts, sharing wisdom gained from his own life experiences and helping Marcus understand the long-term perspective on community and conflict. Other homeowners who'd found their voices during the confrontation remained engaged and active, creating a core group of residents committed to ensuring Meadowbrook Estates never again fell under the control of someone like Patricia. 5 years after painting his door blue, Marcus still lived in Meadowbrook Estates. His home had become a symbol within the neighborhood, and visitors walking the streets would sometimes stop to take photos of the famous blue door. Marcus found this amusing but also meaningful. That door represented something larger than itself, the principle that individual expression mattered, that arbitrary rules enforced capriciously should be challenged, and that communities were stronger when they celebrated diversity rather than demanding conformity. The financial cost of Marcus's fight had ultimately been minimal, thanks to the HOA's reimbursement of his legal fees and the lack of any lasting financial penalties. But even if he'd been forced to bear those costs entirely, Marcus believed the fight would have been worth it. Some things mattered more than money: dignity, justice, the right to feel secure in one's own home without fear of arbitrary punishment. These principles had been at stake in his dispute with Patricia, and defending them had been the right choice, even though the outcome had been uncertain. Looking back on the entire experience, Marcus often thought about the what-ifs. What if he'd repainted his door beige and avoided the whole confrontation? Patricia would still be terrorizing the neighborhood, accumulating power and misusing HOA funds. Robert and countless others would have suffered without anyone ever holding Patricia accountable. The community would have remained divided and fearful, with engaged homeownership replaced by resentful compliance. Marcus's life certainly would have been simpler and less stressful if he'd backed down, but the world would have been slightly worse for it. There's a broader lesson in Marcus's story that extends to anyone facing similar situations in HOAs or other contexts where power is abused. Systems of oppression, even small-scale ones like an overbearing HOA president, rely on the compliance and silence of those being oppressed. They count on people making the rational calculation that fighting back costs more than simply enduring the abuse. They depend on individuals being isolated, unaware that others share their grievances and would support resistance if someone were brave enough to lead. Breaking this cycle requires someone willing to accept the personal cost of being first, of standing up before the outcome is certain, of risking loss for the possibility of change. Marcus hadn't set out to be that person. He'd just wanted to paint his door blue and had refused to back down when threatened for doing so. But that simple act of resistance, combined with his willingness to follow through even when the stakes increased, had been enough to shatter Patricia's power and liberate an entire community. The transformation of Meadowbrook Estates from a fearful, controlled community to an engaged, self-governing one didn't happen overnight or without setbacks. There were moments in the years following Patricia's departure when old habits reasserted themselves, when board members fell back into patterns of opaque decision-making, or when homeowners became complacent and disengaged. But each time this happened, the community had the mechanisms and the memory to correct course. They knew what they were protecting against, having lived through the alternative. So what's the ultimate takeaway from the story of Marcus and his blue door? It's this: never underestimate the impact of standing up for yourself and your principles, even over something that seems small or trivial. That blue door wasn't really about the color or the aesthetics. It was about whether Marcus would accept being bullied, whether he would allow someone else to dictate how he lived in his own home based on arbitrary preferences rather than legitimate community needs. His refusal to be bullied became a catalyst for exposing larger abuses and reforming an entire system. For anyone currently facing an overbearing HOA, a petty neighborhood tyrant, or any situation where authority is being abused, Marcus's story offers both inspiration and practical guidance. Document everything. Know your rights and the governing documents. Seek legal advice early. Look for allies who share your concerns. Be willing to stand firm even when pressured to back down. And remember that organizations and systems can change when people insist on accountability and fair treatment. The blue door still brightens Marcus's facade, a daily reminder of what he fought for and won. But more importantly, it's a reminder visible to everyone who passes that individuals have power that communities can change, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not over grand principles, but over something as simple as the right to choose your own door color. How would your community be different if more people had Marcus's courage to stand up against petty tyranny and abuse of power? Would you be willing to paint your door blue, metaphorically speaking, and face whatever consequences came from refusing to comply with unjust demands? These are questions worth considering because in countless communities across the country, there are people like Patricia wielding power without accountability, and people like Robert suffering in silence, waiting for someone brave enough to say, enough. Marcus's blue door stands as a testament to the power of individual courage, the importance of community solidarity, and the possibility of transforming broken systems when good people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. It's a story about HOAs, yes, Still, it's really a story about human nature, the corrupting influence of unchecked power, and the redemptive potential of ordinary people who decide that enough is enough and choose to fight back, regardless of the personal cost. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Change begins not with perfect conditions or guaranteed outcomes, but with one person deciding that something matters enough to take a stand. Sometimes that stand is as simple as painting your door blue and refusing to repaint it beige. Sometimes that simple act is enough to change everything. Final thought. If you're currently dealing with an HOA dispute or know someone who is, what's your blue door? What's the line you won't let them cross? The principle that matters enough to fight for? Please share your stories in the comments below, because every person who speaks up makes it easier for the next person to find their courage. And remember, those who abuse power count on your silence. Please don't give them that advantage.